Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, Donald Trump has hired his third national security advisor in 14 months after replacing General McMaster with the notoriously hawkish former United Nations ambassador John Bolton. The move has unsettled allies who fear the move will serve to harden US foreign policy and do away with the Iran deal. Our Washington correspondent Kylie Morris reports.
As is President Trump's way, he announced the appointment of his new national security advisor on his preferred platform, Twitter.
Breaking just moments ago, the news that General H.R. McMaster, who is the second national security advisor for the Trump administration, will be leaving that post in early April. Former U.S. ambassador to the UN, John Bolton, will be his replacement.
McMaster is the sixth senior advisor to leave in as many weeks.
God bless America.
Secretary of State Rex Tillerson was shown the door only last Tuesday. Trump's new national security czar, John Bolton, enters the White House with a hawkish reputation, a pro-Israel, anti-Iran patriot, not shy of a little war fighting.
The Iranian regime must be made aware that if it continues down the path of international isolation, there will be tangible and painful consequences.
John Bolton served in the Republican administrations of Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush, and was a strong advocate for the Iraq War. His support based on Saddam Hussein developing weapons of mass destruction, a belief that turned out to be catastrophically wrong. As UN ambassador under George W. Bush, he criticised the effectiveness of the UN itself and wasn't afraid to advocate military force. Those views don't appear to have changed since he was last in government. He's a cheerleader for military action against North Korea and Iran, so his appointment is rendered all the more electric by a decision due on the Iran deal in May and a summit imminent between Donald Trump and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. How John Bolton chooses to insert himself into this critical foreign policy moment, likely to have massive repercussions not only for the US but the rest of the world as well. So we do have a very relevant sense of what John Bolton might be advising Donald Trump when he takes up his position, because he's a very regular commentator on TV, on Fox News, where he has spoken about the necessity that Donald Trump take the strongest stance possible on North Korea, even speaking of potentially advocating a preemptive strike against North Korea. That's not a very popularly held view, certainly amongst senior military advisors, but it's something that John Bolton insists should be on the table for the United States. Similarly, the Iran deal, he is of one mind with the new Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo. They both think it's a wrong-headed deal, that Donald Trump should get rid of it as soon as he can, regardless of the wishes of key allies like the UK.
I mean, there's a whole array of concerns about John Bolton, but one in particular raised today, isn't there? Tell us about that.
Well, this has got to do with, yes, you guessed it, Cambridge Analytica. They were involved with a number of politicians' campaigns before they got involved with Donald Trump's campaign. And this was back in 2014. We understand now that John Bolton was an early adopter of the kinds of services that Cambridge Analytica was offering. At the time, he was running his own super PAC, so a kind of external funding body to help the Republican campaign and politicians who were trying to win their seats back in 2014. We're hearing from Chris Wiley, the former research director for the company. He's spoken to the New York Times. He says that some of that ill-gotten Facebook data may have been used by John Bolton at that time.
Kylie, thanks very much.
It's sometimes hard to keep up with the comings and goings in Donald Trump's White House staff, but it's fair to say there is a degree of shock at his latest shuffle of the pack. Out from his innermost cabal of senior advisers goes the moderating voice of General H.R. McMaster. Replacing him as National Security Advisor comes the rather more hawkish, and that's perhaps putting it mildly, John Bolton, a controversial figure who's been known to advocate the possibility of preemptive strikes against the likes of Iran and North Korea.
This is perhaps the most contentious, the most incendiary appointment of Trump's presidency.
we may be on the verge of 2 nuclear crises.
Is such a stark, lurching change.
I think this appointment is very bad news.
We have a lot of good news to report.
As the president signed a new federal budget today, spending billions of dollars more on defense, it's the appointment of John Bolton as National Security Advisor that has so deeply alarmed the Washington foreign policy establishment. It is also causing dismay among US allies, especially in Europe and Asia. The reason for that alarm is that Bolton has long been dismissive about the effectiveness of diplomacy and been withering about the need to work with US allies. This was Bolton speaking just a year ago, giving Trump advice on the Iran nuclear deal.
And he should abrogate that deal, end that deal as soon as possible. Our leaders should not expect, nor should they seek, the approval of the international high-minded.
Analysts are now warning that with Bolton as a key player in the White House, Iranian-US diplomacy is doomed.
What I'm afraid of is that the Iranians will become convinced that some form of attack against Iran is just a question of time at this point, that it is inevitable. And if they're convinced of that, they will start act accordingly, which means that they are then likely to leave the agreement or at a minimum start pursuing even more aggressive policies in the region as a deterrence against what they will believe is an inevitable American attack.
So after a tumultuous first 15 months in power, and with an extraordinary turnover of staff at the White House, who are the key figures now around the president? What does the new inner circle look like? There is John Bolton as the National Security Advisor, perhaps the most controversial diplomat of his generation. Trump's economic guru is Peter Navarro, the US trade representative, and an unapologetic protectionist who's driving talk of a trade war. Mike Pompeo, the CIA director, is the incoming Secretary of State. He is widely seen as wanting to blow up the Iran nuclear deal. General John Kelly is the White House Chief of Staff, a hardliner on the wall and on immigration. And yesterday, Joseph diGenova became Trump's new lawyer, a conspiracy theorist who believes the FBI has a secret agenda to frame Trump. Finally, there is the Defense Secretary Jim Mattis, perhaps the only moderate, or as Trump's critics like to call him, the last adult in the room. And at the center of it all is Donald Trump, reportedly relishing the chaos and knowing that the high-stakes summit with North Korea's Kim Jong-un is now fast approaching. John Bolton also believes that it is, in his words, perfectly legitimate to launch a preemptive strike on North Korea. Now he can argue that case from one of the most influential positions in the US government. No wonder tonight that American allies are so concerned. Robert Moore, News at 10, Washington.
I'm going to come back to the subject of Russia in a moment, but news has broken since we've been on air. Quite big news. President Trump has replaced his national security advisor, H.R. McMaster. He's replaced him, so another big personnel change there, with the Bush-era defence hawk. Now, that's John Bolton. We can have a very quick chat to Chris Butler in Washington. Chris, this is a really big change in direction on foreign policy, I'd say, no?
Yeah, and I think it follows Rex Tillerson, has been replaced as Secretary of State by Mike Pompeo, so you're getting a real sense of a change in tone, particularly on foreign policy, from the White House. As yet another one departs from that door behind me. John Bolton is someone who is regarded as being a real hardliner, extremely critical of North Korea, extremely critical of Iran, and perhaps not as moderating an influence as both H.R. McMaster and Rex Tillerson were. So I think you are getting a changing of the guard inside the White House when it comes to foreign policy. Some will argue that it's also to do with President Trump himself and the fact that he has not really had a great relationship with either H.R. McMaster or Rex Tillerson. In fact, in the case of H.R. McMaster, he actually criticised and publicly rebuked him for some comments he made about Russia's interference in the election in 2016 being something that was clearly happened. Well, President Trump says that isn't the case, of course, and it didn't affect the result. So there have been public rebukes, but wider, there are big questions now about what happens in terms of foreign policy. And that's particularly important when you take a look at what's happening with North Korea and that idea that President Trump will meet Kim Jong-un.
Chris, thank you very much. Thanks.